Unless Congress takes action, millions of Americans are likely to be evicted from their homes very soon. And this problem is more than just a crisis. This is a crisis that the American people are dealing with, but there's also a crisis when it comes to Congress and how utterly feckless our lawmakers are when it comes to providing the economic relief that Americans desperately need. So there have been numerous stories published about the number of Americans who are likely to be evicted, but these numbers keep ballooning. So for instance, last week, the federal moratorium on evictions and also on federally backed mortgages expired. And so there are some states that have implemented their own eviction moratoriums, but you have to keep in mind that some states have not done so, and we still have tens of millions of Americans who are jobless, who have lost their health care coverage as a result of being laid off in the middle of this pandemic. And then you also have Republicans who refuse to extend the unemployment benefits that were provided under the CARES Act. That was the additional $600 a week that Americans would receive if they filed for unemployment. Unfortunately, it seems like there are some members of Democratic leadership who are going along with the lies and the deceptions that are being messaged to the American people. So before we get to that, I want to share some statistics with you. The Urban Institute estimated that provision covered nearly 30% of the country's rental units. And I'm talking about the moratorium on evictions. By one estimate, some 40 million Americans could be evicted during the public health crisis. And of course, this is the most unsurprising part about all of this. Minority groups are the most vulnerable when it comes to eviction. So people of color, according to CNBC, are especially vulnerable, while almost half of white tenants say they're highly confident they can continue to pay their rent. Just 26% of African American tenants could say the same. Around half of Hispanic tenants said they have little to no confidence they'll be able to stay in their homes. And if you look at data state by state to see how states are impacted by this, you look at Louisiana, for instance, 50% of tenants say that they can no longer afford their rent. You have 51% who say that they can't afford their rent in Florida, 58% in Tennessee, 59% in West Virginia. And again, Benjamin, I'd love for you to jump in. The frustration here is the utter lack of leadership, not just in the federal government with the Trump administration, but also with Congress.
Right. What we're seeing here is just it's shocking, but it's not surprising, right? It's almost like the natural culmination of how our leadership has been leading, the direction they've been going. They are really pushing the people as far as they possibly can. I think our friend Ken Klippenstein on Twitter said that they're trying to find the very least that they could possibly do without causing a riot. But when these numbers start hitting the fan, right? When people actually are put out of their homes with nowhere to go, and then if they're lucky enough to get in a homeless shelter, like we do not have the capacity to house all of these people in the homeless shelters across this country. But even in that scenario, they would then be exposing their families to COVID-19. This is not something that's tenable, but the fact that they're playing chicken and taking it all the way to the wire is disgusting.
Absolutely. So you have the moratorium on evictions on one hand, and then you also have the issue of the unemployment benefits, which are set to expire on the last day of July. And so, of course, when you hear the rhetoric coming from the Senate GOP and also from the White House, there's this lie that keeps getting repeated over and over again about how, well, these unemployment benefits are just too high. And as a result, people are refusing to go back to work. In fact, one of the Republican senators who was perpetuating this nonsense was Ted Cruz over the weekend. Let's take a listen to what he had to say. And then I want to compare what he said to Democratic leadership. Listen.
In terms of the unemployment benefits, do you object to providing any kind or any amount of federal boost to unemployment at this point? Because not everyone is choosing to be out of work.
The policy that Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats are pushing adds an additional $600 a week of federal money to unemployment. We have the unemployment system.
Right, and McConnell wants to take it down to 70% of prior wages.
The problem is, for 68% of people receiving it right now, they are being paid more on unemployment than they made in their job. And I'll tell you, I've spoken to small business owners all over the state of Texas who are trying to reopen, and they're calling their waiters and waitresses, they're calling their busboys, and they won't come back. And of course they won't come back because the federal government is paying, in some instances, twice as much money to stay home.
But you're open to a lesser amount?
Look, what we ought to focus on, instead of just shoveling trillions out the door, we ought to be passing a recovery bill. Now, what's a recovery bill? A recovery bill would be lifting the taxes and the regulations that are hammering small businesses so that people can go back to work. A recovery bill would suspend the payroll tax, which would give a pay raise to everyone in America who's working. That actually gets people back to work.
The recovery bill that Ted Cruz is talking about there has nothing to do with increasing wages for the average worker at all. In fact, what he's referring to is payroll tax cuts, which would gut Social Security and Medicare, okay? And Benjamin, I've talked about this on the show, but maybe I'm wrong. I'd love to hear from you. How exactly does unemployment work? So let's say you're collecting unemployment, right? You were laid off as a result of the shutdowns following the pandemic or during the pandemic. And then your employer says, okay, we're opening back up. We want you to come back to work. What happens then?
Exactly, you get no more benefit if you have the opportunity to work. There is a small provision in the CARES Act that says that they are not required to search for work during the pandemic. But in any normal case, if you're offered work and you turn it down, you no longer get that unemployment benefit. And then they snuck something in there. Mitch McConnell's trying to give people 70% of their prior wages. We're talking about people whose wages were not sustainable in the first place. People who couldn't afford to pay rent, and now you only want them to get 70%. Listen, I've been on unemployment and I've seen it's like $240 a week. And that's just not something that you could live on, especially when you're taking care of a family. So they're playing the same game they always play.
And so they're lying about how the system works and essentially defaming people who need to rely on unemployment during this pandemic. And then on top of that, the argument just on its face is disgusting because even if what they were saying were true, which it's not, don't you think that there's a problem that $600 a week is so much more than what employers are paying their employees, right? So if in the middle of this crisis, this CARES Act has provided more of a stable income for the average American than what corporations and companies in this country offer to their employees, that's a problem. That's a huge problem. Yeah. But unfortunately, House leadership, like House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, seem to completely buy into this narrative. Here he is.
Some Republicans say is that $600 serves as a disincentive to go back to work. It is more in some cases than they say that people were making at the beginning. So what do you say to that?
And I think that's an argument that has some validity to it. And we ought to deal with that.
I just want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly. It does seem like you might be willing to come off some from $600, not to $200, but you're not demanding $600 or bust?
Look, it's not $600 or bust. You don't, Speaker Pelosi said the other day, which I thought was a great line, we don't have red lines, we have values. And we're going into these negotiations with values. To say that if 600 or nothing, no, that's not where we are.
Okay.
We're prepared to discuss this.
Yeah, absolutely pathetic. Benjamin, care to comment on the values of Democratic leadership?
Yeah, thank you for setting it up exactly like that. Because Nancy Pelosi always talks about this phrase, show me your budget, show me your values. They showed us their budget last week when they refused to take 10% off of the Pentagon budget. All the Democrats, or the majority of the Democrats, refused to do that. That's where their values are. Their values are not in protecting the American people. It's not creating a sustainable system to keep people safe in their homes until this pandemic is over. It's the consideration of opening schools back up to force people into untenable situations. I don't want to hear about values from another politician when they are up there playing games with our lives.
And this is why it's so important to primary politicians like Steny Hoyer. Sometimes we win, sometimes we don't, but it doesn't matter. We need to challenge this type of thought process, because what's the point of having a two-party system when you have Democratic leadership that goes along with whatever nonsense Republicans are trying to put out there? I mean, the demonization of workers in this country is incredible. especially because the vast majority of people would like to go to work, but people have health concerns. People don't even have the option in a lot of cases to go back to work. We still have tens of millions of Americans who are jobless right now and don't have health care as a result of that. So the last thing we need is this type of rhetoric coming from Democratic leadership. But unfortunately, this is what we get because they're completely disconnected from what the average American is dealing with right now.
And I would say that they're complicit, right? At this point, like for years, I always thought the Democrats were either just feckless or they're cowards, but they are complicit with this. They have enough people working on their staff to know everything that we know and then some. And the fact that they come out here and this is what they want to say, they are complicit with the ruling elite who do not care. I have to watch my mouth when I talk about these people. They do not care about the working class.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. We really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.